Released on March 11, 2022, Eric Larroca's You Lost a Lot of Blood has received gleaming praises from critics and fans for its unorthodox structure, its exploration of depravity, and thematic elements not typically found in genre fiction. Indeed, what many genre fiction fans will initially find appealing in Larroca's latest novel, in its depictions of raw gore, unrestrained sexuality, and body horror, staples of the genre, are certainly all present here. However, what sets You've Lost a Lot of Blood apart from typical horror dwellings, amongst all of its gore and excess, is its intricate and intimate psychological storytelling, with characters and stories steeped in pathos and symbolism. Unfortunately, You've Lost a Lot of Blood is a rough experience. Rough, not just in its relaying of its dark, sordid details that leave you feeling uncomfortable, uneasy, or as one of the characters in the book would put it, disturbed, but creative and structural choices plague You've Lost a Lot of Blood, making the overall experience more jagged than intended, never quite finding its mark as a result. While it's clear that author Larroca sought to elevate the art form and genre from its typical tropes of extreme violence and one-note psychopathy, by focusing more on the psychological and parasocial aspects of its deranged and trauma-ridden characters, the issues at hand here almost certainly persist as a result of Larroca's overt ambitions, as we'll be exploring in bigger details in this video. Though, that's not to say that Larroca's latest novel does not have its strengths. You've Lost a Lot of Blood is a faulty and at times awkward novel to be sure. But much like its characters and story beats, its biggest strengths lie in its cunning nature to deceive. While the cover and title are drenched in their own sanguinity, surprisingly, the novel is actually a far more thematic experience than visceral. While the book has its share of extreme violence, depraved dialogues between characters, and explores taboo subject matter, the blood and gore are actually relatively sparse, a creative choice I imagine of author Larroca favoring quality over quantity. So, with that said, what exactly is You've Lost a Lot of Blood? And apologies ahead of time if this gets a bit confusing. You've Lost a Lot of Blood is actually a novel within a novel. The title being the namesake of central character Marta Black's fictitious novella, You've Lost a Lot of Blood. The entirety of Larroca's novel is presented as a credulous yet fictional non-exhaustive catalog/archive of Marta Black's works and poems, including the aforementioned novella, as well as it includes specific transcripts of phone recordings between Black and his partner Ambrose, the importance of which will become clear in a moment. The purpose of this catalog, as the book's fictional editor states, is largely educational and preventive, to provide better insight into the aberrant mind of Black and others like him, so as to prevent any future suffering for potential victims. You come to quickly realize that Marta Black is a prolific serial killer, whose modus operandi involves dressing and mutilating his victims' bodies to resemble great works of art, with the cherry on top being that he also takes with him a piece of his victim's bone, typically an index finger, as a souvenir. Marta Black's You've Lost a Lot of Blood, published in 2018 by the In-Universe Publishing House and fictitious Carter Hill Press, is the heart of Larroca's novel. A captivating and unsuspecting sci-fi body horror. The story is about young game designer Tamsin Dearling and her kid brother, Presley Dearling, as they travel to meet enigmatic game developer Abbas Sempago to work on his equally mysterious passion project and latest game, You've Lost a Lot of Blood. Stop me if you heard this before. While certainly not without its flaws, Black's novella is certainly the highlight of Larroca's latest work, a highly symbolic and thematic novella filled with references to machinery, sludge, disembodiment, and insects, stand-ins for Marta Black's real-life despair and existential dread. You come to understand these overarching themes and the overall creative personage of Black by the way of the parasocial details inserted here and there throughout the novel, presented in the form of Black's poems and conversational recordings with his partner Ambrose. Structurally, the book presents several chapters, typically 2 to 4, of Black's novella at a time, interspaced by said poems and conversations. And unfortunately, this structural choice is where Larroca's work really starts to stumble. While there's certainly a lot of fun to be had in exploring and deciphering authorial intended motivations, especially in deranged characters like Marta Black, in which the novel explicitly presents his works and dialogues as a means to gain better insight into the mind of such a character, and in the process revealing the far more salacious and sinister motivations beneath the surface. Unfortunately, these pertinent sections, the poems, the dialogues, just ruin the momentum of the much better story being told. This problem is multifaceted. Let me explain. Black's novella is where, as a reader, you'll be spending most of your time. While being really entertaining, it's also easily the best written parts of the book. The story's characters aren't perfect, yet captivating, and even as they reveal considerable flaws and morally questionable actions, you never truly feel yourself rooting against them or judging them acutely. As the novel gradually progresses further and further into the otherworldly and disturbing, with increasing depictions of metal and human abominations bursting at their sinewy mechanical seams with gushes of hot, blackened oil, its humanistically flawed characters ground the story in a realism that serves as an incredible contrast between its often guttural and visceral setting and its intimate and emotional character study, often blending the two harmoniously. So exploring this story in the story further, Tamsin, the novella's central character, is hired to lead development of Sempago's augmented and virtual reality game You've Lost a Lot of Blood. A game, as Sempago puts it, can only be played once. We come to learn that the game's development and its developer, Sempago, have been shrouded in controversy, with Sempago's latest pageant project being implicated in the death of a player. As the story progresses, we come to learn that Tamsin suffers some severe guilt and trauma related to the passing of her parents in a car accident, an accident that she pins the bulk of the blame on her kid brother Presley. Presley is Tamsin's precocious younger brother who has a deep interest in literature, often spending the bulk of his day musing and reading books, even sneaking novels to read past his bedtime. We come to understand that Tamsin and Presley's parents died a year prior to the story taking place, their car colliding with the spun-out tractor on a highway as they were on their way to pick up Presley from the library. Through the course of the story, we see Tamsin grapple with the trauma of losing both her parents, and the lasting guilt and anger she has over Presley and her attempts to abandon him unsuspectingly. Along with these rich themes, the novel gradually morphs into the uncanny, almost Lynchian in its portrayal of the disturbing. Descriptions of a jarring mechanical humanoid figure seen emerging from the brush, policemen and shopkeepers eerily espousing cryptic prophetic phrases unprovoked, and the introduction of a strange machine that people enter but never come out. Often, we as the readers, not entirely sure if Tamsin is actually all there, hallucinating, insane, or both. It's clear that things are not as they appear. So you could imagine how a story like this could draw you in. It's creepy, unsettling, and captivatingly mysterious, only for the momentum to come to a complete standstill by having to read Black's laborious conversations in other works. And, oh boy, these conversations. Let's talk about these horrible conversations. These sections in the book, presented as literal arguments between Black and his partner Ambrose, are intended to relay more broad philosophical and even metaphysical concepts to the reader, with the intended goal of helping us decipher Black's particular emotional state and worldview, furthering our understanding of how his reasoning colors and motivates his works. On a deeper level, these sections undoubtedly serve to spell out the various theses of Larroca's work, between arguments on the differences between scary and disturbing, philosophical waxing on what truly separates us from animals, and, most importantly, metaphysical musings on the nature of creative theft and what truly constitutes plagiarism. And we'll get back to this one. It's clear Larroca wanted us to ponder how these arguments apply and relate to his novel, either in part as character motivation, or even ontologically to the entire novel as a whole. Again, we'll come back to this. So, one of the clearest faults of the book are these arguments, specifically how they're presented. They are just so grating. Reading these sections, we come to quickly understand one particular thing. That Black and his boyfriend Ambrose are just so damn unlikable. And that's most likely a deliberate choice considering who these people are. A murderer and his romantic accomplice. They're not supposed to be likable. But the real objective fault here isn't the substance of their arguments. The arguments themselves are just so clumsily presented. They become a real chore to read through. Leading, argumentative, contrarian, and seemingly ad hoc in nature. Reading Black and Ambrose argue is like reading an expanded YouTube comment thread about gamers and politics where the most obnoxious people alive just refuse to shut the up. Adding to the drivel is that it's also really pretentious, and I hate using that word, but there's really no other way to describe it. To me, it seemed author Eric Larroca watched a little too much Lars von Trier and decided that pretentious non-conversation conversation should be part of his book too. And, oh look, he's a mediocre man who hates women and just murdered someone in a fit of rage. Okay, let me tell you how this relates to Picasso and the Pythagoras theorem. But Larroca would never actually do the oh my god. Now, the novel also throws in Black's poems, which themselves are mostly fine. And I'm a bit conflicted on this one because while one of the pieces in particular, titled Chernobyl, a poem about a cancer diagnosis, is literally one of the most beautiful things I ever read. It's hauntingly intimate and conveys an absolute tragedy in very little words. Still, these poems momentarily halt you from reading the much better story being told. These structural issues really ping-pong into one another, and it highlights a lot of the weird editorial choices made throughout the novel. Like, for another example, the awkward placement of the book's footnotes. Yes, this book also has footnotes. Typically following a statement in conversation between Black and Ambrose, but most often following the titles of Black's poems. The problem is that they're not presented as footnotes on the actual page, but tacked on all together to the very end of the book. This creates some issues. First, having to turn and reference the back of the book whenever a footnote appears, then having to turn back to the pertinent sections of the story, is a bit of a clumsy ask. It's not a huge ask, and I suppose with a basic bookmark this problem is non-existent. But why not just stick the references to the bottom of the page like any other regular footnote? If it was an issue with not wanting to break the formatting or presentation of a specific section, why not just stick the references to a single page at the end of each section? The book already has segments broken up by these gaudy centipede illustrations. I imagine it wouldn't have looked any worse for wear with the addition of references here and there. Okay, maybe I'm nitpicking. I initially thought these notes relegated to the back pages were some sort of appendix, and it appears to be formatted that way. Though while the section is labeled notes, the unconventional formatting of the entire book did create some brief confusion as to whether or not this is an actual appendix. So, follow me here. You find the first footnote number in the opening of the book. So when I had to flip to the end of the book, I just started to find it. I'm sure you could forgive me for my confusion at least a little bit. Now, I will be fair and say this issue is mostly individualized, a part of reader error. And ultimately, it's not a really big deal considering this notes section is pretty sparse and doesn't really relay much important character information. But I did want to highlight that these little quirks of structure are littered throughout the book. So with that said, we now need to talk about the biggest flaw of the book. Its ending. So, major spoiler for the book I've been spoiling so far without warning. Martyr Black is a full-blown plagiarist. His poems, his novella, all stolen from prior victims. Why? Well, because, as he puts it, the false expectations and pressure of society were just too much on him, with adults often showering him with praise as a small child, highlighting his potentials for greatness, only to be catastrophically let down as he slowly emerged as the mediocre man he was, stealing others' works as a means to create the greatness he felt he was owed. In the process, not letting others in, not letting them truly know the real Black. A hollow man carved out of guilt of his true nature. Suddenly it's fucking Fight Club. Now, this is actually a pretty neat ending. The problem is that it's in the wrong book. The thing is that this ending serves as a real rug pull, and not in a good way. The real fault here is that the story doesn't work to justify its ending. Through the course of the book, we've gotten tidbits here and there relating to various manners of creative minutiae. You know, arguments between Black and Ambrose about art, what constitutes a particular genre or style, when our story is appropriate, what is originality, and one specific conversation devoted to the nature of plagiarism. But nothing that would have given any real appropriate indication to Black being a fraud. I mean, we do get references here and there in that specific conversation about plagiarism that hints to this conclusion. These little stream of conscious quibbles where Black briefly says he doesn't have an original bone in his body and that all he does is take and take. But these little stream of conscious quibbles are literally a few of many throughout the entire novel. So you don't really take these little thoughts and rants to have the most weight individually, but rather work to color his character as a whole. After all, this book is presented as a means to understand the mind and motivations of Black. So for this one specific conversation about creative theft, an argument where we come to understand that Black believes plagiarism is merely an academic construct and that originality does not exist, then to justify these beliefs, invokes his highly elaborate crime scenes as evidence? What? To end up encapsulating the entire book is just a bit silly. Okay, I have to stop here and explain something. You might have noticed that, as I'm explaining the confusing and awkward structuring and narrative issues of the book, that they actually seem to make total sense as the words come out of my mouth. This is an issue that arose with trying to actually construct a cohesive narrative of the book for this video. And by doing so, I end up accidentally fixing a lot of the real present jank and editorial faults of the novel. This is why, early in my video, I stuck in a disclaimer about the book's plots and themes potentially getting very confusing. A relic of early scriptwriting that stuck. Having read the book and knowing fully well the painstaking reconstruction that I have to make to relay anything comprehensible for the purposes of criticism, but still being concerned that relaying the book would still not make much sense. So just trust me when I say that the book has issues that go beyond simple reader investment and narrative construction. And even as the story may seem to make sense as I explain it, especially for the remainder of this video, that's not without a lot of excessive work and reconstruction on my part. Honestly, just read the book for yourself and you'll immediately understand everything I'm talking about. Or, well, maybe you won't. Anyways, back to it. Moreover, it's kind of a non sequitur that doesn't really say anything about Black's character that we don't already know. We know he's a bad person, we know he murders, and we know he's duplicitous. Him being a plagiarist doesn't really add anything of value. And as a matter of fact, this revelation actually makes the story worse. Let me explain. The problem is that the story doesn't quite know how to handle its own ending. As we now know, Black's works aren't his. As the fictional editor states in the closing of the book, none of the works found within were written by Martyr Black. Now, it's hard to really describe without having read the book how confusing and seemingly illegible this makes the entire story, but allow me to try. Along with his poems and transcripts, there are these, what I can only surmise are long-form poems by Black. They're presented as sort of stream of consciousness dialogues, more akin to diary entries than a traditional poem. These sections reveal more intimate details of Black's life, typically as Black himself describes some of his murders. The problem with the plagiarism revelation, that all Black's works are stolen, is that it seemingly collides with the accounts of these long-form poems. Within these sections, aspects of Black's character are reinforced. Black is a murderer, his victims are typically young men, and he collects fleshy souvenirs from his victims as his calling card. Traits all corroborated by not only Ambrose, but also by the fictional editor of the book. Moreover, Black constantly refers to and has a fascination with skin, bones, and insects, aspects that often find their way into his conversations and manifest in his stolen works. So while the story concludes that none of the published material in the book were his, the text paints a more nebulous picture. Black is an original, and as he puts it, has nothing of value to contribute to the world. Yet, he's shown in the story to be very much capable of artistry that is unique to him and his pathology. This is what I ultimately mean about the story being at odds with its own ending. Specific characterization and the text itself often collide with this reveal, trying to suggest one thing about his characters while it clearly says another. So as Black is indeed capable of his own creations, even if they are highly derivative, there's no reasonable person, for example, that would consider the arrangement of his crime scenes to resemble great works of art to be acts of plagiarism, something that Black specifically argues as an example of the blurred lines of artistic theft. And yes, that is an insane and extreme argument, and perhaps not entirely made in earnest by Black, and something that Ambrose very correctly points out would be more akin to a tribute or homage. But the point is that this, alongside other arguments made by Black on the matter, showcases his understanding of the plasticity and amorphousness of originality, and what we, as humans, consider theft and what we don't. Now, the reason I'm laboring this specific point is that all of this argumentativeness between characters suggests that the author himself was aware of the leap of logic that would be required for the reader to believe that his highly opinionated characters that are almost painfully aware of the philosophical, ethical, and moral implications of creative theft would suddenly become absolutists on the matter, wholeheartedly believing that Black is a plagiarist because he pieced together his published works, with no gray area in between. I mean, the works he published aren't his, but they also aren't his victims, if that makes any sense. His works and conversations do contain common aspects and themes across each other, which I'll get more into in a bit, and some of these may contain organic material from Black, or those too may just be regurgitations from other authors that Black stole from. Either way, this Frankenstein approach, as the novel puts it, to creative works would likely inspire more nuanced discussion on the matter than simply labeling its author as a thief, especially between two guys that often have a lot to say about even the most trite details. Now, as a side note, I do feel that this nebulousness around Black's thievery was, or maybe even is supposed to be, one of the points of the novel as well, an attempt at sort of a novelized version of the Ship of Theseus. But because of its overall awkward structuring and its sloppy juggling of its themes, it makes drawing any specific conclusions about its meanings or purpose largely an exercise in futility. As Black now revealingly puts it, stories don't have to have any points. All creative thoughts are inherently unoriginal, and you can make whatever you want from them. But if that's been the point all along, what's with the obsession with imagery, themes, and symbolism? Why go to painstaking lengths for these things, only to say it doesn't matter? Now, I don't want to sound like I have sour grapes over the conclusion of the book. I do think these rug pull type endings could be really cool and make for some really interesting reading experiences, but much like when J.K. Rowling declared that Dumbledore was gay all along, despite nothing in her novels really supporting that, your text does have to support your conclusion beyond the passing or granular details. So I really hate this phrase, but it's actually one of the few expressions that applies very well to the situation. If everything is special, nothing is. Now, there's different forms of that expression that manifest in conversation depending on the context, and as I come to gather my thoughts over this book for this video, the version, if everything is meaningful, nothing is, rang the most clear in my mind. Because at the ending of the book, large swaths of the themes and accompanying imagery and symbolism within Black's works are kind of left without any discernible meaning or purpose, and while that may also be the clumsy point of it all, that stories don't have to mean anything, that conclusion is also seemingly at odds with the actual text. So, insects. Insect imagery, to be specific, is often referenced across Black's works and conversations. In one example, Black, in a different argument with Ambrose, this time about the nature of killing or being killed, refers to himself as a parasitic worm, an insect that thrives and ultimately kills its host, doing so out of survival, not exactly aware of the harm it's causing. The comparison suggests that Black's psychopathy and homicidal tendencies are an inherent part of his nature. In his novella, insects, specifically mechanical centipedes, are the parasitic worms that infect its human hosts, transfiguring and mutilating their bodies into metal and cock abominations that ultimately destroy the host in a violent oil-laden eruption. Now, these mechanical parasites are heavily implied to be the true source of the cause of the corruption of the human body. The story's protagonist, Tamsin, towards the conclusion of the story, is shown overcoming several of the resultant mechanical monstrosities, and ultimately destroys the parasitic centipedes as they slither out of the metal husks. The story presents these beings as very clear antagonists, the theming suggesting that Black has at least some awareness of the harmfulness of his true nature. The novella's ending also seems to tie in pretty well with Black's real-life despair and nihilism, revealing all along that the story was a seemingly never-ending time loop in a constructed world where its beings are bound to ceaseless repetition and failure, mirroring Black's real feelings about the pointlessness of existence, and how he would rather live, as he puts it, a headless cockroach, than to continue living like this. Now, I will be fair and say that's a meaning I personally constructed from Black's narrative, though, in my defense, I think it's pretty squarely backed by the text itself, though your mileage may vary here and there. Now, because of the reveal that Black's works are stolen, none of this narrative construction ultimately matters, because we don't know exactly what he's stolen, or what has been organically imbued with meaning and purpose by Black. These aspects can mean anything, or, succinctly, nothing at all. The reveal that Black is ultimately a writing hack with his works not meaning anything at all would be fine if the story was from, say, the point of view of a weird stressed out college student, and wasn't explicitly trying to get you to construct a narrative with painstaking themes and imagery thrown about, but seems entirely incongruous from a character steeped in pathos and underlying trauma, who, you know, is also a murderer. It's a lazy ending to a book that ultimately wants to say a lot, but is squarely undermined by a slew of awkward creative choices. It really is a book that wants to have it both ways. It wants to be about the mind of a creepy killer. It wants to be about trauma and guilt, and it wants to get the reader thinking about some real serious shit. But it also desperately wants to be about none of those things at all, about how people read too much into things, and how characters and stories are ultimately just meaningless things we read to pass the time. And that's sort of my preemptive response to people who may say the book's ending is actually very successful because it got dorks like me to ponder what any of it actually means. but I would argue it places most, if not all, of the heavy lifting on the reader, and that its conclusion ultimately gives as much weight to someone deeply interpreting the text as abandoning it altogether. Eric Larroca's You Lost a Lot of Blood is a very thematically conscious novel, to a fault. While its conclusion tries to say otherwise, it does attempt to convey a complexity on the nature of many things we'd rather not talk about: loss, depression, sexuality, anger, guilt, trauma, with most of these things getting lost in the sauce, for lack of a better phrase. You often wonder what the story and its characters were actually trying to convey, and while, in its conclusion, it ultimately has very little to say for itself, its execution leaves more confusion than conclusion. Ooh, great line. 10 out of 10. And this problem is lastly illustrated by the way Martyr Black's sexuality is handled in the book. So, early in the book, we become familiar with Black's homosexuality. Homosexuality? It sounds like he's sick or something. Gayness? Is that better? We come to understand that Black is gay, and that he was outright rejected by his father when it came out to him as a young boy, and that the pocket knife that Black uses to mutilate his victims with was gifted to him by said father, being highly implied that it was for the purposes of ending his own life. And while that's certainly very dark, and can provide some deep insight into why Black is the way he is, it's also kind of, dumb? More importantly, it's at odds with Black's characterization, who often tells, in vivid details, his rendezvous and escapades with numerous romantic partners, who he then typically murders. This rejection pathology is further rendered silly by the addition of his boyfriend Ambrose, who, we come to learn, not only puts up with Black's argumentative shit, actually helps him in cleaning up his crime scenes. And if that isn't true love, I don't know what is. And that's not to say that characters, despite leading generally fulfilling relationships and social lives, can't still experience lasting trauma related to past rejection and abandonment. But it's a whole other thing to say that that very same person then chooses to murder and steal as a response to it. Now, parts of Black's spicy top villain origin story might be, like the rest of his works, another act of fabrication or even stolen outright. But as we've now labored, large swaths of Black's background are in fact corroborated by the characters in the story. So, along the traits we already know. Additionally, we also know that he was displaced from his home at an early age by his own parents, who would then go on to be raised by a quote-unquote noble family. And we know that Black's sexual proclivities and interests run into the bizarre and macabre, so we can surmise that Black's allegations are likely not too far-fetched. The bigger issue at play here is that the abandonment and rejection of Black by his father is one of many things the book can't seem to decide on. Is it the reason he kills? Is it a factor? Probably. Probably not. And the book only cements this problem as Black later opines after a particularly callous murder, that he isn't quite sure why he murders. Okay? I'd also like to point out that it's so dumb that Black understands fully why he plagiarizes, but it's just, I don't know. It's just a vibe, bro, when it comes to murdering other people. Just beautiful. And whatever, that's fine. But again, it seems like a lot of obliqueness from a character so damn opinionated. And no fictional editor, merely pointing this out doesn't make this aspect of the character less dumb. Now, a related issue to this is the book's, dare I say, actual gayness. So, what do I mean by that? Well, we often get passages where Black candidly describes his sexual experiences with other men. And these moments are almost always followed by depictions of extreme violence at the hand of Black. And that does seem a bit weird. It often seems like the book uses Black's sexuality as a prop to shock readers. Now, it may be that I watched these dorks a bit too much, and I imagine raw depictions of gay sex likely still make certain cishet readers uncomfortable, and that is a can of worms I will not be going into here. But placing these scenes next to depictions of extreme violence, and only next to extreme violence, just came off a little strange to me. Now, I'm just a well-meaning dork, and honestly, it's not really my place to say whether or not these scenes are appropriate for the book, and I don't mean to imply anything negative about Larroca himself. I'm just saying they came off a little weird. And who knows, maybe that was the whole point, to gross straight people out, which I'm all for. So, finally, would I recommend Eric Larroca's You've Lost a Lot of Blood? It's complicated. I will say that going over the book and examining it for this review made me really appreciate what it was trying to do, even if it doesn't quite find its mark. I would say that its heart is in the right place, and it's certainly a step above what you would normally find in this genre. Also, that cover. Wow, that is a work of art. I did just read one review of the book somewhere where someone mentioned that if the story was just about the inner novella, it would be a much better book. And I feel that's definitely true. It's really hard to describe how much better written and entertaining the inner story actually is. Though, even as I'm a bit effusive about it, it's not without its quirks. There's definitely its share of character and plot contrivances that don't really sit well, and there are some details in the book that just outright don't make any sense. But I do think you should pick up this book, if only for the cool inner novella. So thank you for watching this. So I realized that this probably came off a lot more critical and maybe meaner than I thought it would be. And that sucks because that's not really what I set out to do. I read this book in one day and I thought it was interesting enough to make a video about because I like really weird things that inspire me, and I thought it'd be a really cool thing to talk about. This thing ballooned way beyond what I originally intended. Putting these videos together takes a stupid amount of time. What I originally set out to make is a simple review of a story that I thought was interesting, because it turns out I just can't shut up about things. And I really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Thank you so much.